Hi there to everyone here in the audience at COP6 and those of you listening in your offices at home or at work. We're very pleased to welcome you to this session on climate-oriented finances and perspectives around that. My name is Paul Faeth. I'm the Global Technical Director for Climate and Energy at Abt Associates. Just a couple of opening remarks. One of the big topics here at COP26, as many of you probably are very aware, is financing for climate-oriented solutions. And three of the issues around that which often come up are how to develop partnerships to make that scale, how to finance and what the appropriate rules are for nature-based solutions, and also how to design these policies and these investments so that they are inclusive of people who have not traditionally been included in the past. We're set this up today. It's a total of 90 minutes. We will have three 30-minute panels. And in the first, we will cover all of these topics more or less around, but primarily focus on partnerships and scaling. Our second will be focused on nature-based solutions, and our third on inclusivity. And to start our first panel, we have with us today Gillian Caldwell, who is the Climate Coordinator for USAID and Deputy Assistant Administrator. I think I have that correct. And Tom Steyer, who has a long career in investing and, as many of you know, had a run for the president as well. What I'd like to do is open, Tom, with you. I should say Tom is also the co-executive chair of Galvanize Climate Solutions, which is a new platform that you're putting together to invest in climate solutions. So the first question is, why are you setting that up? Why now? What do you see as the opportunity?
Paul, thank you. And Gillian, nice to see you. I think that we're at a new phase of addressing our climate crisis. And I think that I was a full-time investor for 33 years, and I walked away from the company that I started at the end of 2012 because I felt as if there was a critical conversation in American society about this issue, about our need to address the climate crisis. And I felt it would be irresponsible for me personally if I weren't part of the people arguing strenuously that we need to address this in a just way and also in an urgent way. And I decided at the end of 2020 that conversation in the United States had in effect been won. If you look at the numbers, 75% of Americans, including 57% of Republicans, believe that we should be addressing our climate crisis in an effective and urgent fashion. I believe that took us to a different stage, which is the execution stage. There's an old saying in investing, strategy is easy, execution is hard. Well, strategy wasn't that easy. But if you look at this COP to me is the evidence that in fact that my analysis that the strategy is done is really true, because you can see that not just the governments of the world, not just the NGOs of the world, not just the multilateral development banks, but the businesses and financial systems of the world are fully prepared to engage in climate solutions. But the second half of the statement is execution is hard. So an old friend and partner of mine, Katie Hall, and I decided it would be important to start a climate solutions-based investment company to invest in the smallest, newest companies on up to the biggest projects. Our motto is innovate, accelerate, scale. And we felt that for this to happen, you were talking about partnerships, all the different things that have to happen. We need new thinking, we need aggressive financing, we need comprehensive partnerships so that in fact, we can not just solve this problem, but solve them in the kind of timely and urgent fashion that addresses a problem that escalates as long as you ignore it. So, from my personal standpoint, the critical statement coming out of COP26 is we've put in place a strategy that still has to ratchet, it still has to get better. But at this point, the question is, we've set out a strategy. A lot of countries and a lot of companies have made a lot of promises. Now let's see if you can really make it happen. And that's what I wanted to be part of.
So by example, it suggests that you have a belief about what the appropriate role of the private sector is. Can you say a little bit more about that and what you might encourage or what other companies or investors to do?
Yeah, well, I think the traditional way to think about capitalism is that, here's how I think about it. Capitalism is a democratic system, but the democracy and the number of votes you have are determined by how many dollars you control. So is it a just system? It's just if you believe that every dollar should be treated fairly, but it's not a just system if you believe that every human being should be treated fairly. That's why we have governments. That's why we have democracy, where every person has an equal vote. So when I think about where capitalism fits in, we absolutely need government leadership, value-driven, justice-driven government leadership to set up a framework for what people are allowed to do in the private sector. But when you think about where has the innovation in this world happened in the 21st century, in the 20th century, in the 19th century, where has the innovation, the true advances? Look, they've come out of companies. When we look at COVID, where we had companies coming up with vaccines in record time to meet a crisis. And what I'm pushing for is what I call movement capitalism, which is the entrepreneurship, the innovation, the competitiveness of the private sector organized to answer society's goals in a just way. But I believe that we need that. That's what we're trying to harness at Galvanize Climate Solutions. And that's how I believe that, in fact, we're going to see immense change faster than people expect coming out of those very animal spirits that at some level have gotten us to this problem in the first place.
Super. Thank you very much, Tom. So Gillian, USAID has come out with a bold new climate strategy this week. Would you give us the highlights of that, please?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So yeah, I'm Gillian Caldwell. I'm the USAID Climate Change Coordinator. So we are really rallying an all of agency response to make the climate crisis one of the very top priorities for the agency, which of course is focused on development worldwide. And as we're all aware, climate change touches each and every part of our lives. And it's got to be a top priority at this stage. So we've just released a draft strategy that will take us through 2030, and it's open for public comment. There's 3 core terrains. We have our direct action, which is where we're looking at mitigation and adaptation and climate finance and equity, with a big focus on partnering with Indigenous peoples and women and youth and marginalized groups. And then we have a systems change area where we're looking at the enabling environment. What can we do to shift the policies and the underlying infrastructure and governance to set the stage for a rapid transition to renewable energy, which is very much what we need. And then we have a do your own part, right? How are we going to change the way we do business to reduce our own carbon footprint, to increase the resilience of our operations worldwide? We've got missions in 80 countries around the world and a presence in 100 countries. In terms of the big numbers, what we're trying to achieve here is 6 billion tons of carbon emissions reductions by 2030, which is the equivalent of the entire US emissions over the course of a year, or taking 1 million cars off the road for a year. As part of that, nature-based solutions will be critical, not just renewable energy, but really thinking about nature and what nature can offer in terms of conserving ecosystems and forests. We want to preserve or restore 100 million acres of land. We also want to catalyze $150 billion in finance. And that's very ambitious. It's one of the things I want to talk about with us all here today. We want to ensure that all 80 countries in which we have mission presence are working with whatever resources they can deploy to support the countries they're in to deliver on their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions, their commitments under the Paris Agreement, many of which have been ratcheted up in preparation for this COP. And finally, we want to ensure that in at least 40 countries where we work, we are really looking at some of the underlying systemic causes of inequity and addressing those at a structural level. And what underlines the whole strategy is a heavy emphasis on equity and also on locally led development. You know, a big agency like USAID that makes grants at our scale really struggles to get money to the ground. And we do work through a broad range of intermediaries, many of which are based in the global north, and many of which do excellent work. But we really need to find a mechanism for getting the support to the ground level where we can ensure that sustainability at a civil society level that, you know, that enables the kind of economic and social justice we need at this point in time.
So at 150 billion leveraged in private capital, what's the vision for how that works? Like, how would you work with someone like Tom or another investor to make that happen?
Yep. So good question. It's not just private. This could be public finance as well. But I'll give you one example of leveraging private finance. We were just speaking about this earlier. I just got out of a meeting with a group of leaders from the Caribbean community, and they said that one of the grants we gave them, $3,000, was invested to provide technical assistance to a country that was applying to the Green Climate Fund, which of course is a multi-billion-dollar investment vehicle, but difficult to access for, you know, many countries around the world. That $3,000 investment that they made as a result of our grant to them leveraged a $45 million grant from the Green Climate Fund. So that's I don't even know that you're better at math than me, Paul, so you can tell me what kind of a return on investment is, right? So a lot of times we talk about looking for a 10x investment yield. That's 15,000. Okay, so that's an unusually high return on investment. When it comes to working with the private sector, you know, we partner oftentimes with a development finance corporation. You'll be hearing from Jake Levine shortly. That's another U.S. government entity. And what we're able to do is to kind of address some of the risks that the private sector wouldn't be prepared to absorb through mechanisms akin to a first loss guarantee. We also are able to vet pipelines, right? Through our on-the-ground relationships with governments and civil society, we have access and insight into what's working and which investments are viable. So we can do the vetting. We can provide some initial capital that can help make it, you know, a more profitable investment for private vendors. And, you know, I think beyond that, we also need from the private sector a different set of expectations, especially where we're talking about adaptation. I mean, the vast majority of the money that's coming from the private sector is going into mitigation because it's more profitable. But as we all know, climate change is here and it's here to stay in a big way. And if we don't pay attention to adaptation, which frankly, if you take a longer term horizon for investment, yields substantial returns on investment, we're just not going to have the healthy, thriving societies in which, you know, on which private sector actually depends to continue running their businesses. So those are some of the things we're thinking about when it comes to the private sector.
Great, thanks, Gillian. Tom, what would you like to see from an agency like USAID or other international development agencies in terms of, you know, helping you to accelerate your investments and, you know, develop partnerships to be successful?
So I think it's really important when you're looking at, you know, what I guess the term of art now is blended finance, which is really a partnership on an investment basis of organizations with different mandates. So that you could be looking at a nonprofit, you know, a foundation, you could be looking at a government organization, you could be looking at a private company. I think it's important to start with the idea they have different mandates. And then to be aware they have different capabilities and they all have something to offer to work together. And I think when we think about solving this problem in an urgent and just way, it's important to remember that This is going to be society as a whole making it happen. It's not going to be the government. It's not going to be the nonprofits, and it's not going to be business. It's going to be all of the above. And so when you think about how a government agency can interact with a nonprofit or with a business, start with the idea that the return to a government agency is not just money. In fact, it's often not money at all. What they're looking for is a return in terms of impact and outcome. It's also true that they have capabilities in terms of information, relationships, and access that are different from anybody else, any major government in the world. So they're bringing things to the table that are differentially powerful in a partnership. I would say in the same way that an NGO or a multilateral development bank is different from a company. And when you think about a company, what do they bring to the table? Capability of affecting projects, of making it happen, of running projects. They're also bringing capital, but their capital, I don't believe that business people are venal, awful people at all. But I do believe that they feel that their responsibility is to get returns for their shareholders first and foremost. That's what I've seen consistently. And so in this, they're bringing capability and money, but they're also bringing fear of losing money. And so in here, in blended finance is the idea that with different mandates and different incentives and different measurements of success, you can put together a project that meets everybody's needs, and where what each partner brings is something differential and helpful, and that together society can in fact act urgently and justly in a way that Gillian was described. And I think that the real question here, in my mind, to a large extent, is an awareness of those differences and a realistic trust in each other. That, I think sometimes you see in the private sector a cartoonish depiction of people who work in government, unfair and inaccurate. And similarly, on the other side, people in government can be very distrustful of people in the private sector. I think for this to work, that's why I was talking about movement capitalism. There has to be an awareness here that there is a goal, a shared goal that we're trying to accomplish in the context of different capabilities and different mandates.
Just build on that
Yeah,
to
sure.
give you an example of another role I think we play. In Colombia, for example, we have been working, as we do in many countries around the world, to help the government design and pull off a renewable energy auction, right? So this will enable the government to purchase renewable energy at an affordable and predictable price over the long term. And if you're familiar with corruption, as I am, because I used to run an organization that investigates corruption, you know that the energy markets are very rich with corruption historically. Let's put it that way. And so these transparent energy auctions are an opportunity for competitive bidding to enable governments to provide, this energy at a renewable, at an affordable price. And in a recent auction we did in Colombia, which of course private investors and companies could engage with, we were able to enable Colombia to purchase renewable energy for the long term at 15% below market rate. And it's estimated that that auction alone will yield approximately $865 million in investment for the country. So, and that, that's the kind of sort of stage setting that we can do to open the door, for American companies or others.
So, and I think it's also important to say this: as we look around the world, renewable energy at this point is cheaper virtually everywhere than fossil fuel energy, without actually charging fossil fuel energy anything for their pollution, whether it be carbon pollution or co-pollutions in terms of air pollution. And so if we have free and open bids like this, where people are bidding to supply the energy and the lowest price wins, clean energy is going to win every time. The issue is going to turn out to be, and this is why actually this partnership is so important, is it's not going to be about whether the generation of clean energy is cheaper than coal or natural gas. It is cheaper, very substantially cheaper. The issue is going to be, is it going to be done in a circumstance so that it can be delivered given its intermittency, that the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, and therefore they're going to have to be accompanying things to enable it. I think that this is the kind of thing where the partnership really makes a difference.
And that's where, again, you know, we have a lot of technical expertise, and we also collaborate with the Department of Energy, the Renewable Energy Labs, to provide the technical guidance to ensure that grid redundancy, the distributed grid capability, the battery storage capability, to enable the long-term reliability of these energy sources, because that's so critically necessary.
Tom, you mentioned in an earlier conversation about how much money goes to mitigation, and how, you know, little goes to relatively to adaptation, et cetera. And climate modeling shows not only do we have to stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, but we also need to start taking it out, which of course is happening naturally through the growth of trees, soil carbon sequestration. I'm wondering, in the platform that you're developing, do you envision, you know, making investments at some point in, you know, nature-based solutions?
So in some point also includes the past, since we've already done it. Look, our family has run a regenerative ag operation for 15 or 20 years to try and show that developments in agriculture can change emissions from agriculture and can sequester carbon on a net basis very substantially. And that is an idea which is, you know, its time has definitely come, and we can see it happening, and it's actually really important. In terms of nature-based solutions, what are we really talking about? We're talking about regenerative agriculture, less emissions, a way to, you know, protect the soil, protect the water, and also sequester carbon. But we're also talking about doing new things in nature which will suck carbon out of the atmosphere on a grand scale and actually enable us one of the important ways that we can reach net zero. Because as everyone knows, we're not talking about getting to zero emissions, we're talking about getting to net zero emissions. And to put that in a context, we emit something like 42 gigatons of carbon a year. And in 2050, the estimates that we'll have somewhere between 5 and 20 gigatons that we need to suck out of the atmosphere every year. That's a huge deal. And when you think about that and put a price on carbon, you know, you can quickly get to $1 trillion industry. Does a huge part of that have to be nature-based? In my opinion, yes. You know, there are two ways of thinking about this. One of them is mechanical carbon capture, transportation, and sequestration, and the other is nature-based. And that is, there are a whole host of, in my mind, extremely exciting things using nature-based, ag-based, and forestry-based, but also ocean-based, playing off some of the incredible information technology and data gathering basis and artificial intelligence to do this on a grand scale. And do I think that this is inevitably got to be a huge part of getting to net zero? I absolutely believe in it, and I think that it's incredibly important. If you think the goal is innovate, accelerate, scale, this is a perfect example of, we have to prove this can be done. We have to innovate. We've got to make it happen as fast as possible. And then we have to scale to a grand level, because you're talking about creating an enormous annual business that has to exist for us to achieve what we are trying to achieve, and that I believe will exist in a way that transfers money very substantially to developing nations from the first world.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the transfer of money and nature-based solutions. So to give you another example of some work we did in Colombia, through Colombia's carbon market, we helped leverage $24 million for Afro-Caribbean communities, which will yield an estimated 6.1 million tons of carbon reductions, because these are communities that are being paid to steward the forests, which in most cases, especially where indigenous communities are concerned, has been something they've been doing very capably for a millennium, and that's part of the reason indigenous communities are so central to our strategy, because they have been effectively stewarding the lungs of the planet for so many years. And if we don't, empower and enable them to care for the land, we're just not going to get where we need to go. So, there is a lot of opportunity. I think there's concern, and I understand it, about commercializing nature. And it's even, sort of antithetical, of course, to the way many people think about nature, including indigenous communities. At the same time, if we don't give people incentives to preserve and conserve, they will continue to cut down forests and kill endangered species to sell them on an international market. So, there has to be a way to enable people to survive and thrive in the ecosystems where they've lived historically.
So, Gillian, you mentioned earlier equity. This is obviously you represent a development agency, and serving the poor is the key mission for USAID. So in the climate finance aspect and in your strategy, what do you see as in terms of being able to do differently or in partnership with climate finance that would actually serve, and develop solutions in an equitable way to reach so that everyone can access the benefits?
So we've just, I think I'm going to get ahead of myself with an announcement, but let's just say locally led adaptation is going to be a core priority for USAID moving forward.
You can announce here, that would be fine.
You may have heard our administrator Samantha Power speak on our 60th birthday, which was just yesterday, I think, about the fact that USAID is really going to prioritize getting funding to the more local level. And that's, I said earlier, not something we've done historically. So if we're serious about equity, we really have to change the way we do business, and we have to identify partners that have relationships closer to the ground and ensure that indigenous communities, Black and brown folks more broadly, and women are better empowered with the resources we have to provide. So that's going to be very central to how we think about doing things moving forward. I think we've got a good basis in relationships, but we need to do better, because one of the goals that the administrator set for us is to ensure that 25% of USAID's aid is going to local communities. And it might be surprising that more of it isn't. That doesn't sound like a lot in the scheme of things, but we're at 6% right now. And that goes back to what I said earlier about the scale of the investments we make and the capacity required to manage those investments. We just launched a new website, actually, which is sort of a step-by-step guide for people who want to partner with USAID for communities on the ground, to try to demystify and make it more possible to access the resources we have to offer.
Tom, what's your take on that question, on equity?
So I'm from California, and California has for a long time had the most progressive energy laws in the United States, and for a while in the world. And there's been a reason that that's happened, because in California, the idea of environmental justice, the inclusion and leadership of people from the lowest income communities in California has been the hallmark of our politics. So if you look at our cap and trade system in 2007 and all of the climate specific approaches since then, they have been led in the legislature and led on the ground by people from the poorest zip codes, overwhelmingly Black and brown people. And that has been the formulation of the policy and the success of the politics. And if you extrapolate that idea from California to the world, we obviously have a very similar, not exactly the same, but the same kind of syndrome, where there is a concentration of pain and suffering in vulnerable communities who've basically done nothing. In California, it's air pollution, asthma, toxic water, and disease. Globally, it's countries that are developing that have not emitted a lot of CO2, which are very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, who in fact, in many cases have been net sequesters of carbon, have not chopped down the Amazon rainforest where they live, have not, you know, dug up all this coal and burned it, but who are suffering disproportionately. And so as I think about why do we care about climate change? Honestly, we care about climate change because it could cause unimaginable human suffering. In dealing with that issue, Gillian's point is absolutely right. It's got to be done in a human context with an awareness about justice, about how what people have done in the past and what they're suffering now and how those two are related. And so I think it's going to be absolutely essential in thinking about this, not just to design systems that are fair, but to include in the very start of the design people who are in the developing world, who have a perspective that no one else can have, and whose information, opinion, and moral clarity is very important to this solution. And I think that if we do that, once again, we'll get the right policy. And in addition, it will work in a moral and political sense, which it has to work, because this is not just a question. I think, honestly, and I was saying strategy is easy, execution is hard. Okay, there's technical stuff to do. This is very much of a human execution that has to occur with the agreement of people around the world, which means it has to be just. And that's going to be a huge sticking point in terms of actually executing the promises that the countries have made this week, that the companies have made. If people won't agree to it because it's unfair, it will not happen. And that will in and of itself make the whole idea fail, and it should fail.
Do you have a comment, Gillian, to help us wrap up here, and then we'll be done?
Well, I would like to associate myself with everything Tom just said, because it was beautifully put. But you know, you alluded to this question of participation, and you know, where Indigenous people are concerned, there's something called free, prior, and informed consent. And each single word in that legal framework is incredibly important. And what that requires is that there is meaningful and deliberate and careful consultation with communities before decisions are made that impact the lands on which they live. And you know, it's not just the right thing to do from an ethical and a legal perspective. It's also the necessary thing to do when it comes to the kind of opposition you can and will face if you try to move into lands that have sacred integrity, as we've seen with the Keystone XL pipeline in the United States. I mean, think about the financial consequences of the failure to acknowledge the importance of that land to those people. It wasn't just about carbon in that context and keeping it in the ground. It was about the sacred terrain on which, you know, that pipeline was planned. So, yeah, I think we have to change the way we do business. All of us have to change the way we do business. I'm not just pointing the finger at the companies. You know, we all need to think differently, including the development agencies that have a history of a kind of a colonial orientation when it comes to development.
Thank you both very much, Tom and Gillian. Really appreciate your comments and your willingness to be present with us today. We're going now to switch to our second panel. So we're going to do.
Thank you, Paul.
Yes.
Thank you, Paul.
Very nice to see you. Very well done.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So don't go away, everybody. We are just taking a minute here. Giulia? I'm going to continue, yes. So just those two. Okay. Wherever you randomly decide to sit down. But please do sit down. We are ready to go. If we could advance the slide, whoever is responsible for that. Well, thank you. We are now starting our second of three panels. Oh, right, of course. We don't want to have... Great. We're now starting our second of three panels, and this one will be focused on nature-based solutions. I'd like to make sure I get the name right because I had it misspelled. So I'm going to refer Giulia Carbone, who is with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the Director of Natural Based Solutions Alliance. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. I should have looked. Go ahead. I'll let you say since I blew it.
Thank you, Paul. I'm the director of the Natural Climate Solution Alliance.
Okay. Thank you. I was kind of close.
Yeah.
And Jake is the Chief Climate Officer at the International Development Finance Corporation of the United States government. Did I get that right?
Thank you. That was correct.
That was correct.
Well done.
Okay, great. Thank you much. So we'll start with you, Giulia. Tell us about the Alliance, what it is you're doing, and what the objectives are.
So thank you. And so first of all, the alliance is called the Natural Climate Solution Alliance, and effectively what we mean by natural climate solutions are nature-based solutions for climate. So our solutions that basically are conservation, restoration, or sustainable use of natural resources, actions that bring also benefits to society. And in this case, we are talking about, carbon mitigation, climate mitigation through carbon sequestration, but also have to have biodiversity net gains and benefits for people. That would be the correct definition of a nature-based solution. I come from IUCN. I actually left IUCN a month ago. So, the NBS is really ingrained in it means something. They're not just plain words. Now, the question is, how do we make them mean something in action? So the Alliance was established a couple years ago with a group of, it's a multi-stakeholder platform bringing together companies, project providers, so carbon project providers, certification schemes, NGOs, and some associations. And it's really more like a think tank of organizations that want to scale the nature-based solutions for climate, but in a credible way. So high quality projects, and used also by companies in a credible way. So not undermining the objectives of net zero and the 1.5. So it's complex because basically you will need, the Alliance is really looking at what can we do together, but is not there to replace in a market, is not there to invest in projects, is there to understand what are the gaps and how we can mobilize other actors. Right now, the ecosystem is pretty busy of organizations or initiatives and other alliances. So most of the time when people ask me, or I actually asked myself when I joined this space a month ago, it's like, what is all this happening, and SBTI, and then you have the TCVCM and VCMI and so many different players, but effectively all really play a very important role, because effectively in order to achieve what we want to achieve, there is not one organization that can do it by themselves, because it is about, it's a kind of a hierarchy of action. First, we really need businesses to decarbonize, looking at their scope 1, 2, and 3, and that is the priority. Then is, okay, once you have identified what is your residual per year until you get to your net zero, and then you're still going to have your little residual, what are you going to do with this? Can you go beyond your science-based targets? How can you use solutions that not only bring value in terms of mitigation, but also bring support to nature and people? And I'm passionate, I come from conservation, and I can see, the conservation community that has been struggling to find the business model to really, is not just the money, is a business model to get conservation right, to have people on the ground that believe in conservation and believe that conserving actually has a value. This has happened. This is it, because all of a sudden you can get to communities to explain that looking after a forest is actually something that has value and brings income, and it will give them more than just a plain livelihood, and gives them a real value also to, it's an exchange in a global world. So long answer, but it is really complex to do it well. I know, and I was listening to the previous panel, there is, the financial institutions are really excited, and it's great, because we need money to do these things. But this is not just a financial transaction, because delivering a good nature-based solution on the ground is a complex conservation and development project. And so, for example, it's not about, when companies procure these projects, it's not like procuring cotton that get the lowest price so that you get. This is actually should be a race to the highest and not a race to the bottom, paying more and give more to the community so there is more commitment. So how will the financial market come into this game? I'm not a knowledgeable person in financial markets, but happy to discuss how can we bring all the different players together. And this is really a big challenge for society, that we don't like to collaborate. We are, each of us has its own tribe and we like to work with our tribes. But I think this is the time that we need to break these silos and work together.
So what sort of activities is the Alliance undertaking, Giulia?
So we have looked at the famous guardrails. I mean, what does it mean to be a credible investor or a credible buyer in natural climate solutions? So there are a set of principles that they have worked on, meaning as a company, we believe that you have to, and so this is one of the work we have done. So, consultation with different companies and NGOs and so on, saying, okay, we believe that these 7 steps are necessary for a company to be credible in using carbon credits. We have also put together a similar list for what does it mean. This is very high level. It's an initial. What does it mean to be a high quality credit, right? So what is a high quality natural climate solution? And also what does it mean to be credible in buying? That means what does it mean? How do you actually do the transaction? Is it a spot purchase or you need long-term commitment, for example? So we are trying to put these things on paper, knowing that, of course, they not necessarily respond to what is happening today, but we know that, bit by bit, things will change. And now we have at least a common understanding of these 3 main aspects. We are looking at the supply, highlighting, there are a number of standards out there, so we are not working on standards. We are actually working with existing standards, trying to see what is common, what are best practices. So we are going to issue some lighthouses projects at Davos in January, because we also collaborate with the World Economic Forum. And this is important to showcase what does it mean a project on the ground. I mean, what is it really? We have standards which are really complicated to read as well, but can we see something? What does a project mean in terms of how did they address, I don't know, the challenges of monitoring in terms of carbon, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of, for example, FPIC, which is a critical issue, and so on. So these are the main 2 areas. Tomorrow we are going to present something we are doing on the demand side, so the kind of investment accelerator, but I'll leave that for tomorrow.
So watch her LinkedIn profile for an announcement, I assume. And I should add that all of our speakers are on LinkedIn. So if you want to see more about their bios, you can go there and take a look. Speaking of collaboration, Jake, you had a big announcement today. Would you tell us about that, please?
Why, yes, thank you. So today, DFC announced the largest debt conversion for ocean conservation ever completed. We worked in partnership with the Nature Conservancy and with Credit Suisse and with the government of Belize. And this is really a big deal, actually. We do, DFC this year did about $6.7 billion of new commitments across a variety of sectors: healthcare, climate, gender equity, and tech. We have the authority by statute to have up to $60 billion of commitments under management at any given time. We now have about $31 billion worth of outstanding financing in the market. And we put $610 million to work just in the last few days. This deal closed. The financing from DFC is in the form of insurance, political risk insurance, which creates a key sort of enabling piece to the overall restructuring of sovereign debt that the government of Belize held and was purchased by a third party. And the debt repayment will constitute a major investment in coastal ecosystem management, restoration, resilience for the next years to come. And we love this deal for a lot of reasons, but I want to just mention a couple things that Giulia had raised, because I think it hits some of these really important topics. Not only is this a nature-based solution for carbon removal because it protects key carbon removal ecosystem services such as mangrove forests and coastal ecosystems that are otherwise under threat, and can provide resources for carbon absorption from the atmosphere. But it also, this project is going to protect 13% of the world's coral reefs. And when you talk about that kind of scale, you are protecting marine ecosystems that provide food for humans, that provide the backbone of livelihoods in fishing and in coastal industries, including in tourism, which is
your conservation partners on this, Jake?
The conservation partner is the Nature Conservancy. Credit Suisse is the banking partner, and then, as is the case with I think it would be safe to say basically all of our transactions, because we adhere to a set of IFC standards, performance standards, we partner and ensure that our partners are partnering with local communities and with local stakeholders. And that's the point that I wanted to get to too, which is that ultimately this transaction is really important for the people of Belize, because it will help support their livelihoods, their environment, their ecosystem, and that will redound to all of our benefits, but primarily to theirs.
Is this a new approach for DFC?
It's the first one that we've closed. This so-called debt for—
Is that a hint of things to come?
Well, yes, we want this to be a model. We're really excited about it. There are a number of governments with whom we work who are highly indebted, and who would like to restructure that debt, and who also have tremendous natural resources that are sort of aching for a business model to be protected. Because when you talk about this natural capital and all of the value that it brings, the unfortunate reality is that oftentimes that value is not priced into the market. And so this is one way that we can do that. And this is, we looked at a few of these transactions. This was the first one that we were able to close. They're very complex and difficult because when you start talking about selling debt on the private market, oftentimes that encourages sort of rent-seeking behavior. It's hard to actually close the deal.
Because it goes up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, great. So one of the things that's been a lot of conversation, as I'm sure you're both well aware of some nature-based solutions and carbon offsets being kind of controversial. You know, the degree, you know, all of some of the things that you mentioned, you know, how do you do this well? And I'm just wondering, you know, there've been calls to just push harder on the energy stuff and not use the, you know, kind of nature-based solutions. I'm wondering, starting with you, Giulia, how does the Alliance respond to those sort of critiques?
Yeah. So clearly, let's say a project that looks at renewable energy is a clear-cut project that you can see how much you are saving in terms of, you know, CO2 emissions. Straightforward. Although, you know, if you're looking at the entire value chain and life cycle of renewable energy, there is still something to be resolved, and there are also impacts on nature and people. But I think that the question is that the nature-based solution idea is really bringing together two different crises and trying to solve them at the same time. And are not just two different crises, is that the biodiversity crisis is also creating a stronger response on climate change, and climate change is also making biodiversity loss, you know, even stronger. So in a way, it makes sense that these two elements are addressed together. Now, it's very true that it's not that straightforward to measure how much carbon has been sequestered. And then there are all the questions that we know, you know, in terms of leakage, in terms of additionality, in terms of permanence. And in a lot of these questions will need kind of, I don't think they're going to be a perfect answer, but they will need to be a socially accepted answer to say, okay, this is as well as we can go. And it certainly will need to have, you know, then good standards and very, very good monitoring and evaluation. Responsibility from all to make sure that things are done properly. So this is why we are talking about, high quality in terms of the type of criteria, but also in terms of implementation. What I see here is an amazing opportunity for addressing two terrible crises that that are challenging humanity, and we need to make sure that the bad players don't get to play the game, because the risk is that by some bad actors in the game, it will ruin the opportunity for all. And so that's why we are talking about high quality. There are also bad quality, therefore. It's not all natural climate solutions are born equal, and in fact, those that are not, they shouldn't be even called natural climate solutions. That's why we say it's more than just a name. We have to go deeper. And I think there is still a lot to do in terms of defining what exactly means in terms of social benefits. What do exactly we mean by biodiversity net gain? So we are still at the beginning, and there is a lot to learn. And this is also where I say collaboration is key, because if we still, each of the players stays on its own and does its own things without sharing, we are all going to go so slow that we are not going to address the issue. And if we want to use nature-based solution for their potential 7 gigaton a year, I mean, I trust there is enough business for everybody. So definitely is not a place to compete here. There is enough for everybody. So let's, create platforms where project providers can collaborate and learn lessons learned. There is technology can be used, can be shared, can information be shared, so that we can also create economies of scales in that there is enough for everybody. And the people will benefit. And again, it goes back to the people, because if we're looking at the nature and people part, it will be locally, is specific to a place. The carbon is not, but the people and in nature it is. So we need to go down on the ground and help these projects thrive, and then we get also the carbon.
Right. I was just saying, I read a report last week. The current voluntary market is about $200 million a year globally. And if the rules here at COP26 are set up and formalized, within 10 years, the market could be $800 billion. So it just kind of gives you a sense of that scale. Jake, for DFC, if a company came to you and was looking to do some sort of a carbon offset program that might actually result in carbon being traded and a value, et cetera, would that be a program that DFC would consider?
Absolutely. We're eager to support the market. I think that, first of all, DFC has committed to reaching net zero by the year 2040 ourselves as a financial institution. It's the most ambitious net zero commitment of any G7 DFI, and a big part of our ability to meet that target will be investing in projects that are carbon negative and that are supporting these carbon markets. And we work with the private sector, and I think one of the things that's been tremendously encouraging about this COP as opposed to other past COPs has been just the true enthusiasm, the earnest, authentic enthusiasm from the private sector, and the enormous amount of capital that is going to flow into these markets. And as Giulia mentioned, there's enough to go around. I think the question is, how are we structuring the market? How are we regulating it? How are we ensuring that it's actually working? I'll give you a couple of examples that maybe are cautionary tales. I learned, I'm from California. We have major climate challenges all around, but wildfires have been one of the biggest recent problems. And there was a recent fire, I think last year, in which one of the forests that had been generating carbon offsets went up in flames. And so, we're going to encounter bumps in the road. It's not going to be a linear path. It's going to zig and zag. And the question is, how are we actually moving in the right direction and regulating appropriately? A more positive example, I would say, also from California, are the regulated markets that we have on carbon, where you have a low carbon fuel standard regulating fuels, primarily from oil and gas, but from others as well, where the price of carbon has now regularly traded at the ceiling, which is $200 per ton. And we also have a cap and trade market, which is economy wide, where the price is stable at around $17 or $18 a ton, and that's generating billions of dollars of revenue to invest back into local communities and to invest in plans to create direct emission reductions. And so you kind of have to do it all, but from DFC's perspective, we believe that carbon markets are a big part of the equation, and we want to support the development of them.
Great. So you mentioned at the beginning that you have $60 billion in authority, and you have $31 billion actually under portfolio. So by my math, that's $29 billion that you could apply. And I'm wondering sort of what you need or what the barriers you're facing, you know, to using the full authority.
Well, it's actually hard to spend that much money, it turns out. So, you know, on average, our run rate is roughly about $6 billion a year of new commitments and roughly about $3 to $4 billion a year of commitments that roll off of our books. So call it $2 billion of new commitments. So at that rate, it would take us 15 years to get to our cap. So we're hoping to accelerate. And I think that the big bottleneck in climate is not the capital, it's the projects. And it's the question of how you find good, bankable, investable projects in the markets in which we want to work. We focus in emerging markets, low and low to middle income countries that are bearing the brunt of these impacts and really need the financing support. And, you know, one of the other things that was exciting about DFC's creation was that Congress gave us new tools to be a little bit riskier, to be a little bit more concessional in the way that we provide financing. So not only are we doing debt and insurance, but we're doing equity, funds investment, guarantees, and critically, technical assistance. And we see that this technical assistance can provide really important pre-financing to help projects ripen a little bit more so that they're then ready to be bankable for bigger, later stage, either equity or debt. And I would say to the crowd and whoever is watching and listening, if you are aware of good projects, we are actively filling our pipeline and eager to learn more about the market and identify transactions that we can be helpful with.
Giulia, I think WBCSD has 200 members, something along that. That's a lot of capital, a lot of investment. Where do you see this headed with your alliance and with the members, and you also collaborating with the World Economic Forum? Where do you see this headed?
So you're almost making me talk about tomorrow, but
I'm
no.
very good at that, trying to get these hints.
The secret's out. What we see here is that we want to raise, first of all, and this is a bit, again, you know, the question about what are these carbon credits? These are credits that we imagine are not are not emission credits, are not, let's say, opportunities to emit more. So what we see is this credit should be used only once the company has identified its path to net zero. We all know that there is not switch on and off like that from one day to the next you're going down to zero, so that there is that nice curve that we hope that it goes steep. Certain point it goes to, let's say, 95% of your reduction, but there is that portion that should go down every year, but it's still there. So that's what the part that we are saying, this you can compensate with, you know, nature-based solutions, but it's not about using these to emit more per year. It's very, very clear, because that will basically be undermining the Paris Agreement. And that's exactly what we say, you know, it's important that we build these things on top of each other and connect them very well and very clear. This is not an alternative to, is a complement only after you have demonstrated that you have done everything you can in your 3 scopes and you're on your way to your net zero position. So this is where we stand also as part of the education we want to play, the educational role we want to play with the buyers, the demand, so that the corporates, that they see this, yes, let's invest in nature-based solutions. There are amazing stories. Of course, you know, companies also like them because, you know, we all see corporates having, you know, their nice story on their GRI report on the website. These are stories not just about, you know, tons of carbon, but these are stories about people, about nature. And therefore, it's really important that we use our power to educate and say, yes, but you can come into this, you should come into this game only once you have done your proper clean house and you have your house clean and so on. So that will be how we target, our WBCSD members, WEF, but also beyond. And so the Alliance, for example, which is more the think tank that coming together, but also what we'll launch tomorrow, is open to any company that want to come in and demonstrate that they're doing the right thing in cleaning up their house and then taking action in removing what is left over every year. Now, you were talking about this market being, exploding. If we do the things right, it will explode, but then little by little should go down because
Yes.
we don't want it anymore. I mean, we
Right.
should get to a place, there should be a little bit portion that, what we were talking about, the 5 gigaton a year that we will still need to remove because there will never be a zero, it's a net zero, okay? So it's a net. But in theory, it should go down because in theory, we have restored nature, we have conserved nature. So, but is the next 20 years that will make a difference on our planet and our livelihoods.
Great. Jake, final comment. I'm just wondering, you all are obviously looking to expand your efforts. What do you see for the broader market?
Well, from our perspective, I think that too often it has been the truth in the past, and it still remains true, that when the DFI community talks about climate, they're talking about renewable energy. And within renewable energy, they're really talking about solar. And I think it's time for us to sort of spread our wings and fly and tackle climate as a sort of cross-sectoral, cross-industry matter and be, applying a climate lens to every single transaction that we do, and to be looking for flagship transactions in transportation and buildings, obviously in nature-based solutions, in the types of supply chains that we are going to need for the clean energy industries that are going to power our future. DFC, in the midst of this pandemic that we've all been living through, DFC was able to support the production of vaccines. And not only did we actually produce vaccines, but we supported the key infrastructure required to create billions of vaccines through supply chain developments in key parts of the world that didn't have access to vaccine manufacturing. Now in India, we have supported over 1 billion, the production of over 1 billion vaccines coming onto the market. And we're now we've been in the midst of the next great looming crisis. And I think in the same way that we want to be producing solar panels and wind turbines and electric vehicle batteries, we're also wanting to produce the supply chains and the real enabling environments and supports to do all of that. So for us, it's about expanding, diversifying, trailblazing in new markets, and we're really eager to work with everybody here to do that.
Great, thank you very much. Giulia, Jake, thank you very much for participating with us today. I'm very excited to have you here. We appreciate your presence. Now we'll be moving to our last panel. We'll have we're moving to our last panel, which, okay, we need a moment so that we can wipe mics and the like, so we'll hold on. It has been very interesting for those of you who are not physically present in the room. COP26 is, everyone's wearing their mask with the exceptions of a few, situations like this. We, you see everybody masked up, wiping everything down. Everybody's washing their hands. It's great to see people live, but also we're sort of, not quite, not quite there. Would you like me to wear my mask? Oh, okay. Great, thank you. So for, are we live on the web? Okay. We're live everywhere. Great, so our last session, and this session will focus on questions of inclusivity and equity. We have Stacy Swann, who is the CEO of Climate Finance Advisors. And Stacy has had a long and interesting career in finance in this area, including managing a $750 million fund while she was at IFC. And my colleague, Lindsay Foley, who for Abt is our Director of Climate and Energy. And so what I'd like to do is kick this off, Stacy, with a question for you is, since with this experience that you've had, is there anything that gives you optimism about where we're headed based upon what you've heard here at COP or your other interactions?
Sure. Well, it's day 4 of COP or day 5 of COP. I'm not sure what day it is. It's Friday. But we've had a lot of there's been a lot going on this week. And there's been a lot of announcements this week, and there's been a bit of criticism about some of the announcements. And so I think at the end of the first week of COP, it's still too hard to tell how this COP will come out. And so, put that on pause, and in a week or so we can kind of all take an assessment of how much progress has been made. But coming into COP, I'm actually coming in with quite a bit of optimism for a very specific and narrow reason. Not because I think we're making so much progress on the 1.5 degree goal. We're not. Or because I think action is happening fast enough. It's not. But in the world that I come from, in the financial sector, there's been a bit of a sea change in the last 2 to 3 years in terms of awareness that climate change is a financial risk. And at least for that very narrow set of stakeholders, that's actually got quite that's got quite a driving effect in terms of how I begin to act. And when the financial sector starts to act, oftentimes it acts very quickly. So the financial sector moves on both risk and opportunity. And for 20 years, in terms of climate, people have been trying to seek out the investment opportunities around climate change. It's been renewables. There was the debate about the cost of renewables. Then it's been new technologies and energy efficiency, but energy efficiency has been difficult to finance, all of those things. But recently, investors have become really hyper-focused on the fact that climate change actually brings financial risk. That has, in our clients and what we're seeing, that has actually had a sea change in terms of who inside of financial institutions listening and who's starting to care about how to manage those risks and then what they're going to do about them. So I'm actually quite optimistic that that's going to start a lot of action, accelerate a lot of action among the financial community, not just the pledges, so not just the $130 trillion, which, some people say, is that real? Is that not real? You really have to read the fine print on what that means. But actually not, I think investors are really going to start to look for real pipeline that they can execute on and real deals. I also think they're going to start scrutinizing the investments they make around climate-related risks more closely and more carefully, and I think that's going to have its own effect. So that's kind of giving me some optimism, right? Starting to see risk show up in the pricing spreads of some investors. So how does that land from an investor perspective? You see it in pricing. That's actually pretty telling. However, there's so much more work to do because the investors and the banks and the financial community really does sit at kind of a higher level than the topic of this conversation, which is about inclusion and equity and justice. So I have a lot of optimism because I see that the wind's changing in the financial sector, but I also think there's a whole bunch more work to do to make sure that the financial sector is being driven or driving itself towards kind of equity and inclusion, and I can get into that and other comments.
Well, actually,
let
me go to you, Lindsay. You are manager of Clean Power. Right. Sorry, folks. You're manager of Clean Power Asia, a program that we had for USAID, and I'm wondering over the course of that work, what lessons you learned, and if you could tell us a little bit about the program and what you experienced as the manager of that.
Sure, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to speak on this panel today. I find it quite appropriate that we're having a conversation about inclusion on Youth Day, which is an increasingly loud and prominent voice in the negotiations. So very happy to talk about this today. Indeed, I was the program manager for the USAID Clean Power Asia program, which was a 5-year, $16.5 million program funded by USAID that ran from 2016 until this year. It was focused on supporting countries in Southeast Asia as they drive the transition to a low carbon power sector. So we were working predominantly in the lower Mekong countries of Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, but also supporting the ASEAN region more broadly. And happy to announce that among our accomplishments in that brief 5 years was 16 new policies designed to support grid-connected renewables, over $7 billion in renewable energy investment mobilized, 10 gigawatts of RE installed, and over 93 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent avoided over the next 15 years as a result. I think in terms of lessons learned for climate finance, and in particular, sort of inclusive investment, was taking an ecosystem approach. And this was really critical, being a regional program where each of the countries had varying national contexts, different sort of market conditions, stakeholder groups, and being active. And so we focused on sort of what we called the 4 Ps. So planning, looking at supporting robust decision-making processes that were data-driven, and then on policy, incorporating the results of that planning into policy that could send clear market signals to the private sector to invest, and also set the appropriate incentives to mobilize investment. We then worked with the private sector in a number of variety of ways. One, to ensure that the financial flows coming out of the private sector were aligned with the public sector priorities, but also removing barriers to investment that existed. We worked with corporates that were installing rooftop PV to green their own operations, worked with banks and financial institutions to de-risk investments, and then worked on a number of key guidelines and toolkits to support broader rollout of this. And then we also supported partnerships in Southeast Asia, which is a very active region, working with NGOs, universities, a number of the other MDBs working in this space to really reinforce the work that we were doing and leverage resources to drive action at scale.
Fantastic. So Stacy, in the work that you've been doing over your career, what do you see are some ways in which investments can be made more inclusive, that more people can have access to the benefits of these investments?
Sure. So one of the things that I've done in my career has been, you mentioned at IFC, I set up, established, and ran the blended finance department. And blended finance, for those of you who may not know, it's about taking public or patient capital and using it to catalyze private investment faster than it would otherwise happen. And this is pretty important in terms of, it's a pretty important tool in terms of getting money down to local communities and vulnerable communities that may not otherwise have access to big institutions or big forms of capital. And in fact, kind of one of the things that we need to do kind of as a global community and locally in many countries, even including developed countries, is make sure that the financial ecosystem is built all the way down to the community, that the financial system doesn't just trade with itself, but that you have kind of access to finance at all levels, including at the local level. One of the things that we did with blended finance was support microfinance institutions in emerging markets, which were like blended finance vehicles. I also sit on the board of a green bank in the United States, which is a blended finance vehicle. The theme or the common thread throughout is that there's some public dollars that have a mission and a mandate that are driving the establishment or the creation of some type of financial mechanism, institution, whatever you call it, so that the local communities can actually access the dollars they need to become more resilient, to invest in clean energy, to do the things they need to address climate change. That's actually really important. Blended finance as a theme does that. It takes those public mandate dollars and it drives that public policy into finance. And it does it in a way, it's not easy all the time, but it also does it in a way that can help local communities.
types of projects that might be, like Tom mentioned, mitigation, adaptation, et cetera, in our first panel. And I'm wondering, are there differences between projects and their ability, kind of by their design, to be more inclusive or to provide more benefits to, to those who've been excluded or at the community level?
Absolutely. And I think there are two aspects to that question that I'd like to highlight. One is on the design of investments themselves, the upfront design. And you can focus there on the design on the enabling environment, setting the appropriate policies and incentives for investments. You can do that through the early stage investment design itself, through ensuring that you're engaging communities, you're listening to other voices, you're considering other perspectives. And you can also do it in the creation and strengthening of financial investments that provide greater access to a lot of stakeholders that weren't previously engaged in formalized markets. But you can also think about it in the way that finance can ensure equity and inclusion in the outcomes of those opportunities. And I think that's really, really critical to do. As one of the previous panels had talked about, 93% of financial flows currently go to mitigation projects, only 5% to adaptation programs, about 2% to combined mitigation and adaptation. And when you look at that, it's really striking. And of that, a vast majority is spent on clean energy and transportation projects. Very little is spent on adaptation and nature-based solutions. So I think that's a real critical thing that needs to get addressed, because adaptation investments have a lot of both direct and indirect benefits to the communities around them. But there are barriers that are faced in adaptation finance that aren't as prominent in mitigation finance. And I think among them, just two that I'll highlight, one is that climate impacts are very difficult to predict. They also vary quite significantly by geography, and that creates a lot of risk. And second, I think when you look at the revenue generation models for adaptation programs, it's not as well developed as mitigation programs. And so that's another area where I think we need to triple down on the finance that's going to adaptation projects. And just getting back to that a little bit in sort of the direct and indirect benefits that are provided from that. For instance, when you're developing a grid-connected renewables program, there are a lot of co-benefits that are provided to local communities, whether it's health or climate co-benefits, but there are fewer number of direct benefits, financial, non-financial, that are provided to those communities. But when you get into adaptation and nature-based solutions, that connection is a lot deeper. And I think that's really critical. When you think about a program like certification of climate smart agricultural commodities or sustainable forest production, there's grants that are being provided to offset some of the costs associated with getting that certification. And in doing so, not only do local communities reap the environmental benefits of improved natural resources management, but they also benefit from the increased productivity to their crops and the increased profitability from the products that they produce.
So what are some ways that stakeholder voices, or those who have been historically excluded, how do you bring those voices into finance planning?
I think that gets to the earlier part that I made, and that's getting at the design of interventions from the onset. And I think Tom and a few other panelists sort of talked about making sure that you're intentional in the way that you design climate action and climate investments. One is focused on the enabling environment. So are you removing key barriers to investment in renewables, into nature-based solutions and others, including subsidies and hydrocarbon that have traditionally existed? But are you also incentivizing the right investments? And in doing so, are you listening to communities to design those to developing countries? Are you listening to youth? Are you listening to indigenous populations, so that you're designing them to where they not only benefit those communities, but certainly do no harm. I think in the early stage design of finance, right, it's an intentional focus on inclusiveness. And there are a lot of ways that you can do that, whether it's incorporating climate impacts and modeling into programs, or things like identifying investment criteria that include climate resilience as a key outcome and a selection criteria for what programs you decide to invest in and what not to. And then I think the last is really on again, creating and strengthening financial mechanisms. Stacy talked a lot about sort of access to financial markets and making sure that as we design and mobilize finance, that we're bringing in actors that haven't traditionally been well represented, and in doing so by not just thinking about how you incorporate women-owned businesses and small and medium-sized enterprises, but also how do you incorporate new technologies and new sectors into the climate conversation that maybe have been excluded in the past.
Stacy, when we had lunch earlier this week, you mentioned that a focus on scaling might present some risks to those who have not been included in some of these. And I thought that was a very interesting point that you made. I wonder if you could bring that up for the audience.
Well, and I'll pick up on something that was just said, because this is very important. So we need an all of the above approach on the financing side. There's no public balance sheet that's large enough to address the climate issue. Now the private finance is starting to wake up to the fact that they are going to be bearing some of these risks. And if they don't invest wisely, those things are going to come back in terms of lower returns. But your point about being mindful is really, really important for the public dollars and for the public mandates, because there's no other stakeholder around the table who can ensure that if the public dollars are driving investments, catalyzing something that wouldn't otherwise exist, but for that catalytic role that it plays, it must also take care, mind the vulnerability gap. Because the private sector is not going to do that on its own. Not all private investors. Some might, and Tom might. He's clearly kind of, got the right intentions with what he wants to do with his investment. But the public dollars and the public mandates, public financial institutions, blended finance vehicles where public dollars are being leveraged to bear and share risks for the private sector for the purpose of catalyzing investment, must also come along with that intention to address the vulnerability gap, because it's not going to happen otherwise unless somebody in the room is starting to push for that. And it's in their interest. It's in all of our interests, but from a policy-making perspective, it's in the public sector and the public policy interest to protect the most vulnerable. We know what happens when you don't, and we have to think about this very deliberately. So it's got kind of a driver for public policy, but also as a driver for how you most efficiently spend your public dollars as well. And then I'll say that, not every investment, I want to pick up on the resilience and adaptation point you made, because not every investment is suitable for mobilizing private finance in the same way. If you look across different asset classes and different sectors, you can catalyze a lot of private investment today in a lot of renewable energy. And that's very different for nature-based solutions. So if you're sitting on public dollars and you're sitting on the public balance sheet, you got to think very strategically across a set of infrastructure investments, set of asset classes, and think about where are my dollars going to have the most bang for buck. I might take a little bit here if I want to accelerate or bring forward a renewable energy investment 5 years before it would otherwise happen. But really the role of the public dollars there is to crowd in the private money fast. On nature-based solutions, the revenues are an issue, and you do need to make sure that your financial model, your return profile, all of those things are holistic enough to incorporate the risk side, because that's where kind of nature-based solutions and resilience has kind of been missing in the financial structuring. But also you probably need a little bit more public dollars to catalyze the private dollars. The balance is going to be slightly different than for the renewable project, where all the private investors want to come in because they just pledged $130 trillion and they need pipeline. So, yes, let's get them in. But, when you're sitting on the public balance sheet, you really have to think strategically about how you allocate those dollars.
So as a climate finance advisor, do you often get questions from private financiers about how can we be more inclusive? How do we make sure that what we're doing has that positive benefit?
We do. A lot of the questions these days in the last 18 months has really been around the climate-related financial risks, building off of TCFD and what that opened up. And along with that, so in the last year, climate-related financial risks and ESG have started to come together in a funny way, because there's a lot of people searching for ESG investments. And in the context of an ESG investment, you get a lot more of those social governance things, and then you get that inclusive angle. Investors, I started out my comments by saying I was pretty optimistic because the risk, the quantification of climate-related risks is starting to raise awareness. So awareness is rising steeply. Understanding is still very, very low. Still very, very low. So that we still need to kind of bring up the capacity of investors to really get their hands around this, integrated into their investment process and start making the right investments. But I think that's going to change pretty fast, actually. So along with that, if they are also driven by the ESG momentum, then you will also have the inclusion agenda that comes along with that.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm just going to take a few minutes and sort of wrap up by reflecting on a few things that I've heard over the course of the panel. And first, I guess we all heard from each of the panels were that there's still a lot more that we have to do, that we're not making, the pace of the investments and the pace of change is not fast enough to actually meet, the global targets that have been set. But on the other hand, the possibility exists and is being created, and the momentum, have you said, with this sea change in finance, that it is possible that there could be a lot more investment in private sector capital through partnerships, as we've heard, we've heard Tom and Gillian talk about. We heard Jake talk about the partnership that they have launched for $610 million, the $150 billion that USAID is looking to put in, and being around at COP for this week, there have been a lot of announcements around various partnerships, governments and philanthropy and private capital coming together, looking to make new sorts of investments, new commitments, and to do that in a way that can change the landscape and can change the pace of these investments, which have been fairly slow, beyond just the renewable energy kind of mitigation, which you and Lindsay have both noted. And I, there you can be pessimistic about a lot of stuff around this, but as someone who works on climate and have done for a long time, that's kind of a bummer to hang around on kind of in that space. So I like to take the optimism and to see in this particular space that there really is something exciting happening. I claim the mantle as the original climate guy because in 1988, I put together the world's first carbon offset project between a power plant in a coal-fired power plant, Connecticut, and an agroforestry project run by CARE in Guatemala. And over the last 33 years, this has moved pretty slowly for quite some time. And, as a long-term observer here, I'm excited personally, and I share your optimism, Stacy, about this moment where, for very good reasons, the risks are really being recognized by some very powerful players with an awful lot of money who have the capacity to fundamentally change what happens, in the future. And I think, well, it's just, it's about time, but, it's how I feel about it, but at least it is happening. And so just, closing, hopefully on some note of optimism about, in kind of amongst the things that are, not so optimistic. For those of you here and watching at your desks at home or in your office. I hope you found this valuable. And I'm on LinkedIn. If you feel like making a comment or two to reach me, I'd love to hear your reactions. And again, thank you very much. We appreciate it.